and they'd cut it on the lakes and store it in the ice house. And then by September, it would be gone. But ice stored in sawdust or straw will keep quite a while if it's packed in tightly in an ice house. But now we get an ice cube and think nothing of it. But well, that was something. And you couldn't keep food from spoiling. Milk could be a day or two. It was shot. Of course, people had caves, but then the food would taste from down there, and it wasn't as. It was better than nothing, certainly, but it wasn't as good. And how they cooked on those wood stoves, I don't know.
And in the summertime, you put them.
Oh yeah.
No matter how hot it was.
And how they would bake on a wood stove, How do you keep the temperature constant? They did, obviously they did. On my dad's side, the oldest uncle was Uncle Sam. We didn't see a whole lot of him. His wife's name was Lena. They lived in Sioux City. He worked as a meat cutter much of the time. I think he had done carpenter work too. I know one time he was fired from a butcher place because he wouldn't water down the hamburger they wanted him to. But he was an honest man, a good, hard-working man. They had 4 children. Unfortunately, he outlived all 4 of them. So that was really difficult. And they have many grandchildren. Some of them we still have contact with. Dorothy Donahue is a good friend of Louise's, and she's their granddaughter. But they lived in Sioux City, and we didn't see a whole lot of them. But he died his wife died in 1967. Unfortunately, she had dementia for quite a while before she died. Didn't know what was going on. But his mind was good right up until he was in, and I saw him the day before he died in 1970. And by then, all his children had died, every one of them. Outlived the last one. Matter of fact, his wife died one day and his daughter died the next day, back in 1967, the last one. Well, then there was another one, Uncle Dick. He married to Carrie Petersen. Her parents are buried right next to Grandma and Grandpa in Graceland. They were close friends. And he lived in our neighborhood for a while, but eventually he moved to Waterloo because his daughter lived in Waterloo. He was a carpenter. He was a very good carpenter. Even in old age, he went to work after they moved down there, carpentering, and the young carpenters couldn't keep up with him. He was the type of individual, though, he never stopped. I mean, like if he was, when he was doing something, if he'd be at your house doing work, get done with lunch, he'd put down the fork and he'd pick up the hammer, and he was off and running. And he talked a lot. He had he talked quite a lot. Loved to fish and things like that. He had 3 children, Richard and Marion and Clarence. Richard and Clarence are dead. Marion is still living. She'll be 90 years old in August, and I hear from her regularly. She lives in Waterloo in the house where she and her husband lived most of their lives. She married a man who'd been a prisoner of war in Germany during World War II. He grew up in Sioux City and was drafted into the Army, and his unit was in North Africa. Every man in the unit was either killed or captured. He was captured and he was taken to Eastern Germany, where things weren't ideal, but he survived it. And then the war was coming to an end and the Russians were moving in, so the Germans decided to move them west. So they did. Every day they'd march all day long. At night, they'd sleep in the barns or haystacks or whatever. Then one morning they got up, the guards were gone because they were close to the Allied zone, and the guards knew better than to hang around, so they just left, and they were free. He happened to be on a ship ready to leave Europe when Roosevelt died in April of 1945. But anyway, he worked for the Illinois Central Railroad his whole life. He was a mechanic, and they had 2 children. They're still around. Karen, who lives in Waterloo, and then Bobby is an architect in South Milwaukee. Has designed some extraordinary buildings. He's a very good architect. Clarence has died, and Richard has died. Richard moved to California, and he and his wife are both dead for a long time. Well, then there is Aunt Regina. She married a man named Carl Mogensen, who was Grandma Hogh's brother. She was a child of Grandpa's first marriage, so she wasn't related to Grandma, but she married Grandma's younger brother. And they had a big family. They're all gone now except one, Betty. Betty lives at Sloan, and haven't really heard from her for a long time. I know her husband died a few months ago. But anytime I run into somebody and ask about her, they don't seem to know. So I don't know I've heard she's not in very good health. But they had 3 boys and 3 girls. The one boy died of leukemia as a teenager. And all 3 boys, she outlived all 3 of her sons. Fortunately, she did not outlive her daughters. Although 2 of them didn't last long after she did. But she had not an easy life, certainly. They weren't very well off financially, worked very hard, and in old age, there was no Social Security back then when they retired. So they had a farm. They sold it for what today would be chicken feed, and lived on that for as long as they could until after he died. And then they did give her Social Security eventually. I think they started giving it to everybody. She lived in a nursing home for several years. She lived to be about 94, 95. I don't remember exactly. But she was a very patient, stoic woman. Just took things as they came and lived her life that way. I do have a picture of her when she was young. She was very nice looking. And then, of course, there was Grandma and Grandpa's family, which oldest was Uncle Fred, which you're familiar with, being your grandfather. So you know all about them. And then my dad, who married Lucille, a sister of Aunt Mary. And then, of course, there's the 3 of us who are still around. We're getting old, but we're still around. And then Aunt Martha, she married Louis Jurgensen, and they lived in Morningside. They had no family. And he died in 1973. And she lived quite a while afterwards. She lived to 1991, but she was blind and in pretty bad shape when she died, although she still knew what was going on. And then on Mom's side, there was Katherine, who died as a child of spinal meningitis. She was only sick for 1 or 2 days. It was between Christmas and New Year's. She got a sled for Christmas and was out riding on it, and came in, told Grandma she didn't feel well. So I think she went to lie down, and probably the next day she died.